Hey, what's up, YouTube? It's Justin. In this one, we're going to be talking about the simple power of Django validation, and more specifically, Django Validators. So what we want to do is understand this concept of how do we make our data collection more powerful and more valuable while saving us time, energy, and effort down the line. And this is where validators come in. Now, validators aren't exclusive to Django, but we want to do it on the back end with Django because that makes everything just that much easier to work with, because then it may be fed into our database, and we want to make sure that that data is really good. This is where the validators come in, and that's why you're going to want to go through this video. Of course, it's a little bit more advanced, so I'm going to recommend that you have some experience with Django prior to jumping in. Now, we're going to be using a blog post, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. So definitely check that thing out, because it will give you all the latest and updates for it, and it'll probably be a better reference for you in the long run than this video. This is just about giving you context that may be lost in the actual blog post. Thanks so much for watching, but without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. If you go to this guide right here, it's going to show you all of this stuff just written out in a slightly different way, right? I'm not going to read this thing verbatim. Instead, I'm going to just go through it with you in a way that probably makes a little bit more sense for a video. So the simple power of Django validators. Oftentimes when you are creating a web application, you need to make sure that your data is good. And that's where validators come in. They answer questions like, did Jon a Targaryen already register? Are the names Tyrion, Aegon, Daenerys, Jameson, and Aegard all Game of Thrones characters? The answer is no. And then if the username is the username Voldemort on our blacklist? Like, those are questions that may come up. And validation allows us to figure those things out. Sure, those are kind of silly examples, but validation is the concept that allows Django forms, models, and even Django REST framework serializers to handle this, to make sure that these things are done well and correctly. Now, if you already have worked with Django, this is the guide that will help you better understand validators. If you've never worked with Django before, I don't recommend that you check this out. Instead, I recommend that you go on joincfe.com/YouTube and check out our Try Django series. So for the rest of us that have worked with Django before, let's actually take a look at some of the built-in validators. Now, you might be familiar with models.slug field and models.email field. So basically what these validators do is they make sure that a title field actually turns into, or has to be saved as, title field. And it makes sure that an email is not some string, but rather it is a email, right? That is how these validators work. Otherwise, they'll raise some sort of error. Now, these are built into Django. These are fields that are actually built in. In fact, these fields come off of the validators that are also built into Django that we can use anywhere, right? So we can actually use their validate slug method that would do the same thing as the model. We can also use their validate email method that would also do the same thing as the email field too. And it actually looks like this. So these two fields are equivalent. So the models.slug field is actually equivalent to this right here. It's a character field, or a char field, with the validator of validate slug. Email field is the same way, with the validator of validate slug. Now, these probably aren't actual valid char fields themselves, but the idea here is that validators are being passed into the Django's standard character field. So what that means is Django itself develops a field and then develops abstractions on those fields. Those abstractions often have validation or validators that are passed, right? So slug field is an abstraction of the char field with the addition of that validate slug method in there. We'll see more about this in just a moment, but the point of this is that Django itself designs their fields to work with these validators, and their specialized fields also work with their specialized validators, so they can reuse them. That's kind of the point, is to make them reusable. So before we actually do make them reusable, let's see some that aren't exactly reusable. Let's see a way to validate some data in just a form. So right here, we've got this contact form here, right? So we have one sort of validator in here. Actually, well, we have three validators in here. We have a character field. It does turn everything that goes into it into a string. That's what it does. Email field does something very similar, although it validates an email. So let's see this. I already have this form set up. I have it in a form view itself, a generic form view, and I also already have a URL for it as well as a template. So again, this is why you need to know more about Django to actually get any value out of this, or much value out of this, I should say. So now we're going to go ahead and just take a look at the standard contact form with the standard validations, right? So I'm going to give my name. My name is Justin. I'll give a fake email, ABC, and some content. I hit submit. No errors. Nothing went wrong. And I know this because my submit URL or success URL just goes back to where this form is. So let's try it with an error. I'll say ABC at ABC. Nothing else in it, right? I don't have a .com here, and I'll put some fake content in, hit submit. It says enter a valid email address. This is an example of a validator right in front of us, right there. That shows us this validator. Now, this is a good validator because it's making sure that, hey, when you pass in something that maybe tricks HTML5, so if I just got rid of this and said that and hit submit, notice that it says this is a validator. This is another form of validation. It's just not handled by Django. It's handled by the browser. The web browser is doing that for us. Django is not. Django is doing this. So that means that validation obviously can be handled from other sources than just Django. But we always want to make sure that Django is doing it too. And again, Django has some built-in ways to do that, but we want to make it a little bit more advanced. Let's say, for instance, I want to make sure that my domain name is actually in this email, meaning that if, like, let's say, for instance, I'm Google, I only want to have Google employees to be able to fill out this form. Now, of course, there could be someone log in and do all this other stuff, but that's not really the purpose of this. Instead, the purpose is to check this email field and do the validation directly on that. So how would we do that? Now, I could use these validators, or I could create a custom validator, which we'll get to, but I can also use this method called clean. So define clean. So the clean method, how it works is when the form is submitted, let's say on a view, clean is actually called for each field. It's called for name, it's called for email, it's called for content. Now, in my case, I made these up, right? I made these field names up. So to do a field level validation, we would do something like this. We would say field name, take in self, and then we're going to return something. But we would do the validation in here. So validate here. And then we would return that original field name passed value, or whatever was passed in there for that field name. That's the format of it. So let's actually see it in action. So we'll do define clean email. It takes in self, and we want to get the passed email. So I'll just say email passed equals to self dot cleaned data dot get email. Or in other words, the name of the field, which I've written a few times now. So this is the one that's going to be passed in there. And by default, it's just going to return email passed. And it's still going to go through the field level validation, right? So this is additional field level validation that we're adding. So by default, that will still validate. It will still make sure that it is the email, which is really, really nice for us. It's not like it's overriding the method for validation for this email. Very cool. So then we can do our extra validation, or what our validation would be. In this case, we want to say like email requirement, or email REQ, is yourdomain.com. So I want to make sure that if not your domain, or excuse me, if not email request in email passed, then we're just going to do raise forms.validation error. Validation error, not a valid email. please try again, or whatever message we want. So let's try it out. Let's look at that form. I'll just resubmit it again with whatever in there. Hit submit. Not a valid email. Please try again. So that is a field level validation. Now we can go one step further than that and say define clean. This is a form level validation. And all we do here is call super. Basically, we're calling the default method for this clean by doing that. And then we can run this same stuff. Now, I would probably put this default method in here as cleaned data and just get rid of that self call. And it's roughly the same. So I'm going to go ahead and comment this out, refresh in here and continue. And notice now that it's not around the field, it's now above it. So this is a, let's uncomment this again. This is a field level validation, and this is the form level, which is non-field errors. That's how it's rendered out. This is field error, right? It goes directly on the field, or it's related directly to that field. So this is nice, but it's hardly reusable. I mean, we could copy and paste it, of course, and we could potentially inherit from this contact form and do all sorts of things there, but this is not exactly dry if we want to reuse this. You know, if on our domain, we want to have this same validation everywhere, what do? Right? We want to have it everywhere. Well, I want the same exact thing everywhere. So that means that we're going to have to bring in some reusability portion. I will say one thing though, is if you needed to validate against two things, so I want to make sure that email 1 and email 2 are the same, then I could come in here and say email 2 passed. And this is separate from what we're about to do. Email 2 passed not equal to the email 1 passed not equal emails, or not the same, whatever. So we're not actually going to cover this portion. We're really just covering this portion. We're covering the portion that doesn't rely on another field. Instead, it relies on some attributes for this particular field itself. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't use like stored data in a database, but it just means that the field itself, it's not going to be working with this other field. You would actually write it on here. There's probably not very many use cases where you need to compare the fields in there to get that same sort of validation, with the exception of like emails, maybe passwords. More than likely what you're going to want to do is something like this, where you're like checking to make sure the email being passed is meeting some condition. So now we're going to go ahead and do the reusable method by creating our own validator, much like these validators right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment out this stuff, and all of those things in some form are on that blog post anyway, so I probably will delete them instead because we no longer need those anymore. So now in my app, I'm going to make a new file here called validators.py. And validators.py take in a few, we need at least one thing here. We need to import django.core.exceptions, import validation error. So the validation error class is what we have to import. And now we make a method or a function that will validate any value. So we define validate domain only email. And it's going to take in just a value. We can just return that value if we wanted, or the past value, and we can use this in our form. So in here, we're going to import that with the relative import from validators, import validate domain email only. And then we just add in validators here. Validators equaling to a list of any sort of validations we want. We can add additional ones in here. I'm also going to get rid of email 2. We don't need that. Okay, so now I can actually validate things in here. And what's going to happen is the past value, so the value that's submitted to this form, will be passed to this function. And this function can validate it or not validate it. So let's actually go about validating it. And I'll just say if not yourdomain.com in value, then we're going to raise that same validation error and say, sorry, the email submitted is invalid. Okay. It's also often a good idea to bring in the translation stuff with strings. I'm not gonna really go over that, but it is a good idea to have that in there as well. So now that we've got this, we can validate our email, and it's going to come through, and it should work the exact same way as it did before, but it's going to give us a different actual validation. Oops, we need to make sure that we wrap this in its own parentheses. There we go. Okay, so now it is, and I'll do ABC at Gmail or whatever, fake email, hit submit. Sorry, the email submitted is invalid. So it did our actual validation. Simple, easy, effective. So that doesn't mean that we have to stop here, right? I can actually add in another form if I wanted, and say, for instance, like feedback form. Different form, possibly would have the same validations, right? It's roughly the same form, but now I can reuse this twice, and I don't have to actually copy and paste anything else. In fact, I might get rid of name, and that's it. Feedback form, email, content, that's it. Now I have this way of validating in multiple places. So I can even go one step further and use a model for this exact same thing. And I can put this model in here. So let's say, for instance, inside of this app itself, I can put a model and validate it there. But I can also create another new app, grab that same stuff that we had, paste it in, and new project submission 2, same thing. Those validators will work again. We can also use the Django REST framework to use serializers.py. And I can actually bring in that validator there too. So let's put this in your app. All right. So this is just a standard serializer. It could also be on a model serializer, much like the form can also be on a model form. And that's how our validators can be used and used over and over again. Now, they don't have to be as simple as this. This is just a simple condition. I can also do a list, right? So like I said blacklist, so validate blacklisted of some value. And let's say, for instance, the blacklist equals to ABC, new, and so on, whatever. We can do all sorts of things. If value in blacklist, then we raise our validation error and say, sorry, this value is not valid. Otherwise, we return that value. And now that I've got this, let's bring it into our form for name. Just testing stuff out, right? So validators equals to that name. Now we're going to validate blacklisted and make sure our server's running, come back. I'll just resubmit the same form. Sorry, that value is not valid. So we could do it on content length. We could do it on regular expressions. We can do all sorts of validation right in here. Really cool, very useful, very effective. And when we do it on models, it actually goes over to a model form. So model form will inherit that same validator. Same with a serializer from Django REST Framework. The model serializer will also inherit that validator. So in many cases, it would make the most sense to put the validator directly on the model form itself. So now if we jump into our admin and take a look at our model with that same form submission, we can actually see this by trying out some stuff. I hit save and continue. Sorry, the email submitted is invalid. Of course, I can also do this same thing with the form. So let's go ahead and try it out. I'll just do from.models, import new submission, and I'll just say class new submission form, forms.model, form, class meta, model equals this, field is just the email, and we can bring this into our form, our view, that is, and I won't change the view name, I'll just do that. So we see that it doesn't work here, so let's go ahead and look at it here and say ABC at whatever. And again, sorry, email submitted is invalid. Cool. So the question now is, can we even make our own field that has these validations built in? And the answer to that, of course, is yes. So we can jump into our app and make a new file here called fields.py. We'll do from django.db, import models. We'll also do from django.core.validators, import validate email. And then from .validators, import. We want to validate that most recent one, which was just validate email. And now we'll just do class domain email field. And it's going to inherit from models.char field or the character field. And then we can write in a description and we'll just say an email field specific to our domain. And then we'll just override the initializer method, self args and keyword args, and say keyword args max length. So this is adding a default max length to our character field. And I'll just say 220, keyword args and validators. And these are adding our default validators, which we are going to use validate email as well as validate domain email. And then we'll just run super, or the default init method for this class, which is self and init and args and keyword args. So now we've got this field here. Let's go ahead and bring it into our models. So from .fields, import our domain model field, and I'll just call this domain email equals domain email field, model field here. And I can say blank equals to true, null equals to true. You know, like you could do on a char field or a normal character field. You can do all sorts of things. You can even change the max length on there too, even though it might go back to the default. So that's something you'd have to test out. But anyways, now that we've got that, let's just run python manage.py, make migrations, python manage.py, migrate, run the server again, and back into our fields. We now have two fields here. If I change it or have both of them being the same thing, I hit save and continue. Yes, same validation. Obviously, the same would be true for the actual model form itself, assuming that I have both fields in there. Domain email. Save that. What do you know? Okay, so let's recap here really quickly. Validation is really important when it comes to making sure your data is good. So you want to do validation as much as possible. So first and foremost, validating is better than not validating. So in the case of when we did our clean, so let's scroll down a little bit. When we did our form level and form field level clean methods, those are still valid. There's absolutely nothing wrong with using those. They become wrong or they become not ideal when you copy them. They violate something called dry. We don't want to violate dry. We want to make things nice and reusable in the way that they're supposed to be. When I say in the way they're supposed to be, if you have a validator that you want to use multiple times, make it into its own validator method. And then that's that, right? And then you can use it over and over again. And that's the really nice thing here. In this case, I put it in this app, but you might have a ton of validators and you might put it somewhere else, or you might make its own like third-party package full of validators, because there are ones that exist. So after we decide that, oh yeah, we're going to use these validators, and if I even put it on my models, or if I think I'm going to use it over again on my models, I might as well use my own custom field to have those same validators. And that custom field, then I can just reuse again everywhere I need to use those validators built in. This just saves me some time, and it is still just as effective, right? So I don't have to write out this whole thing. Instead, I just write this out and treat it as any given standard Django built-in field, because that's how they're made. And of course, you don't have to do this field only on a model. This field could be inherited or used as a form field too. So you could make a custom form field in a very similar method as this, but just changing a few things, and also putting in that validator as well. So if you just want it on forms. And the other really good thing about putting it on a model or just making these validators is then you can use it in third-party packages such as Django REST Framework to use it in their fields as well. But again, the built-in model that you've created here, if you use a model form or a model field, it's always going to use these validators. So one of the biggest caveats to validators is if you programmatically call something like this, you might not get the results that you expect. I want you to actually try this out itself. This here should do something different than the model itself. And that is a feature. It's not a bug. It is a feature to working with these items. Validators are not guaranteed to work everywhere is the point, but they will work on model forms, they will work on forms, they will work on serializers, and they will work on the admin, assuming you didn't customize a bunch of things or you didn't divert in a big way from what we just did. So that is the challenge I leave for you, is to see what this does, or any create function based off of something that has a validator. And then I also want to challenge you to see what other sort of validators you can make. What other ones would make sense so you don't have to repeat it over and over again. Blacklisting and also domain verifications are a good start, but these themselves probably can be improved anyway. Like, I did a blacklist here, but can you do a query set? Right? Like, can you do a query set? Can you? Those are the things that I want to leave you with, and hopefully you'll be able to answer those things for yourself. Thanks so much for watching. I hope that you got something from this. If you did, please go to that blog post and let us know in the comments that you enjoyed it. Yes, you can let us know in the comments of this video as well, because we do like hearing back from you about general things on the videos themselves. Questions, very specific questions, please put them on the blog post so we can address them there. Hey, thanks so much for watching. I build everything that I can to help you guys launch your projects faster, better, and more often. So please consider subscribing. JoinCFE.com/YouTube is a quick way to our YouTube channel. JoinCFE.com/projects, and just JoinCFE.com. That is where all of our stuff is, and I really hope that you join us there as well. Thanks again so much, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.